Hello, and welcome to Thriving Kids, a podcast from the Child Mind Institute that helps you raise emotionally healthy kids. I'm Dr. Dave Anderson, clinical psychologist, and your host. Today we're talking about one of the hardest topics for any parent, death and grief. These are experiences we hope our kids don't have to go through terribly often, but when they do, it can be incredibly hard to know what to say or even whether to talk about it at all. I'm joined by Katie Peinovich, a licensed clinical social worker on our school and community programs team. Katie works with children in New York City public schools who've experienced trauma and loss, and she supports the adults around them, parents, teachers, and school staff, in showing up with care and confidence, even in the most painful moments in life. In this episode, we'll talk about why it's okay and important to talk to kids about death and grief. We'll explore how to validate big feelings, how to support your child when you're grieving too, and what healing can look like when we make space for remembering, connection, and hope. Let's get into it. So just getting into what's a difficult topic. Katie, you've worked in schools for decades, worked with patients, worked with kids who've experienced some of the most difficult traumas and losses that anyone could experience. When you're talking with families, with parents about death and grief, what do they tend to be most concerned about for their kids?
So I think there's a couple things. They're obviously very worried about supporting their child, being there for them, helping them through this process. Oftentimes the parents at the same time, parents and caregivers, are also experiencing a loss. And so they may be worried about their own emotions, expressing their own emotions in front of their child, being able to support their child while they're experiencing grief themselves. Is it okay to talk about it? Is it okay to acknowledge the loss to my child? If it makes them sad and they have an emotional response,
Right.
Can I, how do I help them through that? And then if I have an emotional response while I'm talking to my child, is that okay? Is that going to make them feel more sad or increase their grief? So I think those are some of the concerns.
To all of our people listening, we are going to get to all of those questions. You're going to give parents all of those answers. But before, we're going to take a step back. What would you say is like a typical course of grief, like a typical human response to a loss?
I think it's really hard to say that there is a typical course of grief, or that grief proceeds evenly and predictably. I think there are very common emotions: shock, disbelief, sadness, anger, that we all experience in response to a profound loss. Children experience these things too. It may look a little bit different with
Right.
kids, but children also experience these things. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a well-known psychiatrist who kind of posited a theory of grief that it occurred in these stages. I think the emotions that she talks about are things that we are all very familiar with and we all happen, but I haven't found in my work with children, in reading and understanding a little bit more about grief through my work, that it proceeds in a predictable fashion.
And just for those who have not read Kubler-Ross, what are the Kubler-Ross stages if we were to lay those out?
Oh my goodness, I hope I'm going to get it right.
Right.
So
we can just name a few of them. We don't have to have total recall of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it starts off with shock, right? The
Yeah.
feeling that I can't believe this happened.
Right.
Anger, bargaining, depression, and finally ending in acceptance. And
so if we're to look at those things, you said they don't tend to proceed in stages. Like clearly this was like an early kind of way of saying like, I want to try to put some order to the grieving process.
yes.
How much messier is it?
I think it can be a lot messier. I think I've heard it described as more like, rather than proceeding linearly,
No, linearly is definitely, yes. We're really trying to be erudite and scholarly here. We're just going to start using all kinds of stuff. Linearly, yes. In a straight line.
Or in a straight
Yeah.
line,
Yeah.
in a series of steps that are predictable, that you progress through.
Yeah.
It's much more like an oscillating fan, right? Where you may go back and forth between these experiences over time.
Right.
I do think that.
So just on that note, a parent shouldn't feel like, let's say like at first they notice their kid's really sad and then they think, oh, this is awesome. Like, they seem to be coping with the loss of grandma a little bit because after a few days, maybe they seem like they're less sad. Mm-hmm. And maybe like they seem like they're recovering, but they go back to being sad. How would you respond if a parent is like, oh my God, what does this mean?
I would say I think that's okay.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Right. Like we're kind of
Absolutely.
normalizing the idea that it can come in waves.
Yes,
And, you know,
especially with
yeah.
children. I think behaviorally, children will, their grief process may be much more sort of stops and starts.
Yeah.
And so initially, they might not have much of a response.
Yeah.
They may also seem really sad and be very upset, outwardly emotional about it one minute. And then the next minute, they're with their friends, they're playing games, they're
Right.
doing kid stuff. And then a week later, a few days later, the grief may come back in a more pronounced way.
Right. And when those parents, like, I often hear, like, in those first moments, like when a kid maybe doesn't have a reaction just yet, what kinds of questions you get from parents when they're seeing kids experience shock or maybe not having a reaction?
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes there can be a concern. Do they understand what happened?
Yeah.
Is there something wrong that they're not experiencing?
Yeah.
Like what the parent may consider to be a typical grief response. And I think it's all okay.
Right. I get like really rough interpretations, like, do they have empathy? Do they have emotions? Are they dead inside? Like that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Which I think are concerns we all have when we don't feel what we expect to feel. But like, how do you generally respond when they say, wait a second, shouldn't they have feelings or shouldn't I see them be crying? Like their auntie really mattered to them, like that kind of thing.
Right. And I think that's exactly questioning the relationship. Did they not think that this relationship was as important as maybe I thought it was?
Right.
I don't think that a child's reaction is necessarily reflective of the depth or the value of the relationship.
Right.
I think that the responses can be very wide and varied. If a child, one thing we also know about very young children is that they don't necessarily understand death as a permanent concept. So saying to the child, even if we really discourage the use of euphemisms, we want to be clear, we want to be very direct with kids, help them to understand what we mean when we say someone died. But even if we're not using the euphemisms, for some children, they may not, or particularly very young ones, they may not understand death as a permanent concept.
Right.
So they may think that means they're not here right now, but maybe they're coming back.
Right.
That may also be reflective of.
So on that same level, which, as we talk about euphemisms, which may not be a word that everybody gets, kind of like linearly, when if say a parent of like a 7-year-old was asking you, like, what is the script for kind of two questions? Like, my kid said, let's say maybe it's like a little bit younger kid, like a 5-year-old says, what is death? And like how you use non-euphemistic language to explain that. And then like we'll take the scenario of like a 7-year-old who's just experienced a loss in their family. And we say like, how do you explain that loss in a non-euphemistic way or inform them of it? So first, what is death? I am 5, you're explaining death to me. What do you go with?
So I think you want to be really concrete with kids that age. Yeah. Death is when your body stops working and your heart stops beating and you stop breathing and your body doesn't work anymore and you're no longer alive. You're no longer there.
Right. So as a clinician who wants to leave room for the nature of people's experiences as well as their faith backgrounds, what I hear as brilliance in what you just said is you're direct, you're letting them know it's a permanent state in which the body stops working. At the same time, you're leaving this open. Like lots of families might add something to that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So like, what do you hear families talking about adding to that? Like maybe it's the body stops working, but is it common for families to then say, I'm going to layer on top of this like my faith background and what I believe is happening?
Yes,
that kind of thing?
Absolutely. So that does the fact that the body stops working and the person is no longer physically present doesn't preclude families from being able to talk about what they believe personally happens in their culture or in their spiritual or faith background. So they may say things like, depending on their religious beliefs or their spiritual beliefs, they may communicate what they think happens to a person after they die. But I think the important information in order to be clear for children to manage expectations is that the person's body is no longer here with us.
Whether you believe you might meet them in another plane of existence or that this was the end, they're not expecting that tomorrow physically grandma or grandpa is going to show up or their neighbor or something like that.
Right.
So then we get to, the notion of informing them of a loss. What would you say is kind of your basic like script if, say, a loss has happened in the family, a parent knows they've got to tell a child about death? What should they think about in terms of like setting and then what they say in terms of informing a kid?
I think you want to be in a space where you can sit down and you can have the conversation one to one, where you have time, so that you can be with your child through any reaction that they might have. So if their reaction is very emotional, is very strong, that you have time to sit and be with them in that. To sit with them in that reaction, to provide comfort, to answer any questions.
Right.
So I
Not
think,
right before you got to leave for school, not right at the time when they're needing to
right,
go to sleep and it's like after their bedtime, that kind of thing. You're trying to choose a moment where it's kind of like it's got room.
right,
Okay.
right, absolutely.
And then how do you tell parents to introduce it?
Um, I think that can really, I think that can really vary depending on the circumstances.
Yeah.
So if the death is a very sudden one, it may be unexpected for the child.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to, say that you have to tell them something that is upsetting. I don't think you want to build it up too
Right.
much, but it is okay to put a little framing around the conversation.
That's as long as the preamble is, because most kids are going to be like, what?
Yes.
Like that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yes.
You want to keep
Right.
that, you want to keep that short.
Yeah.
And you want to let them know, that you're going to tell them something serious. I think if it is a death that was expected, because maybe there was an illness, it was preceded by an illness, then you might reference that illness and say that illness has stopped the person's body from working altogether, and now the person has died.
And so once you tell them about the death, like, what's your like Katie endorsed stock language for how you tell them you're here for their feelings? Like, what line would you use, or lines? No line is perfect. Let's be clear.
Right.
We get a lot of influencers online who act like there's a magical word you say to your kid,
Yes.
like they're going to have their feelings. But just like in general, what would you say?
Yeah.
Not the magic words, just some words.
I think, I think sometimes you don't even need to necessarily say anything, really just being there and showing support. I had this experience with my own children when they lost their grandmother. And it was after an illness. And so we sort of got to a point where we realized that her death was going to be coming pretty soon. So we were able to prepare the children ahead of time. And when I told my daughter about it, she did have a very, very strong, emotional, really tearful response to that. And so my initial response was really just to sit with her. So I let her know that I was there. I made some physical contact if she, was sort of there if she wanted that. Gave her a hug, held her hand, rubbed her back, and just, let her kind of have that response. Asked her if she had any questions, asked her what she needed from me. So really, I didn't try to direct her emotion in any way. I really just tried to be available.
Yeah. And so let's say that a parent is thinking about this and they're having this kind of initial conversation, and then they're making space for their kids' feelings. They're letting them know that if they have any questions, they're here for it, or they can cope in whatever way they would like. I would imagine that for many parents, a few days, they're kind of thinking like, okay, a kid's still having feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that makes sense. Some parents, I would guess, would ask like, but when should I worry if a kid is having all these emotions? And like, when should I decide that like something is more complicated about their grief or more difficult for them in coping with this death?
I think, like many things, when we have a really wide range of emotional responses that are typical, what we want to look at is function.
Yeah.
So in the immediate aftermath of a loss, the child's grief and there's also a lot of focus in that time, right? People are talking about it. Caregivers may be upset. There's a family in town. Maybe there's a lot of things that are different, right? That are not as usual. But I think after a few weeks, you may expect that the grief isn't something that really goes away, but our life sort of develops around it, right? Gets bigger around it. And so the grief becomes a little bit smaller. And so I think what we're looking for is the child's grief experience for a prolonged amount of time impairing their ability to fully engage with the rest of their life?
Right.
So is their sadness so extreme that it's hard for them to spend time with their friends, hard for them to focus on schoolwork, hard for them to, do what's expected of them around the house,
Right.
be with their family members?
Sorry, I moved my chair there. Yeah.
So when that happens,
Yeah.
that's when we might be, become concerned.
But so if a parent is looking at their kid, I mean, I think there was a nugget of wisdom in there that was really, really important that you said. When you talk about how you view grief over time, it doesn't sound like you're a proponent of getting over it. Like, what do you think about what happens to grief? Clearly, getting over it is not the phrase you use.
Yeah, I don't think that's the goal necessarily.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea that grief is something that we process and then move on from can potentially set us up for feeling like we're not doing grief right somehow if we're still affected by it.
Right.
My grandmother died almost 10 years ago, and last year I had a moment sitting in my car where I just had this like overwhelming wash of grief that came over me.
Yeah.
I tried not to think like, oh gosh, this means I'm right back to the beginning, right?
Totally.
This is part of the normal experience. I'll miss my grandma, for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And also, my missing of her is now mostly around, it doesn't affect the way that I move through my world. I have lovely memories of her.
Yeah.
But I can still sort of fully engage with the rest of my life. So I don't think the goal is necessarily getting over it. I think it is having it change, soften over time, really being able to engage with positive memories of the person without feeling the, acute sort of sadness.
Right.
And having the relationship move from one of, physical presence to one of memory.
And you brought up one other thing, even in your answer there. When do we expect, like especially for like kids and teens, that they might get hit by new waves of grief? Like you were hit, out of the blue by one single reminder. Like, what are some of the more predictable kind of rhythms of it for kids?
So anniversaries can be tough. The anniversary of the death itself can be a time. There also are milestones where maybe that person would usually be there to celebrate. So birthdays, graduations, the birth of a new baby, things like that where that person would have been engaged with the family and part of that experience of the family. Those can be hard times too.
And should parents be worried about saying to kids, like, because, I think a lot of times we worry like bringing up a painful memory might be a problem. Like, I know that, for example, if a kid loses a grandparent, the parent is often thinking of that grandparent, even in those anniversaries, saying, I wish that grandpa was here to see you walk across this stage. Or I wish grandma was here to see, this moment in your life or this birthday you've reached. Should parents be cautious about saying that kind of thing? Like, should they be worried that they're going to cause bad reactions for their kid if they say this stuff?
I don't think so. I think it really frees up the child to speak about their own experience, to feel those feelings themselves.
Yeah.
So I think saying things like grandma or grandpa would have been so proud of you. They would have loved to see you, reach this milestone. I think that's actually really, really important.
Right.
I think talking about the person, incorporate the way that they may have been incorporated in your daily life or the rhythm of your life, having conversations about that person, sort of replace that physical presence, can actually be a really wonderful way to engage with the memory.
And two more key questions that you brought up right at the beginning that we can also kind of bring up the caboose of the podcast with. If we're talking about, we often get the question of, should kids attend funerals? Should they attend, services? Is this bad for them? Should I structure their grieving in any way? How do you answer people on that?
I think it's okay for kids to attend services. particularly the memorial services where it's really an opportunity for people who love that person to share memories. It's nice for them to hear from, people who had all different kinds of relationships with the person who's lost.
Right.
In some faith backgrounds, people have the body on display. I think that's more probably an individual choice that families might want to make.
Sure.
I think it could, in that case, if there is going to be, a wake and the body's going to be there, it's probably a good idea to let the child know ahead of time. Let them know if they would like to approach and see the body or not.
Yeah.
But yes, I think having children attend memorial services or remembrances is really important.
Like you're kind of giving them control over the emotional stimuli they might expose themselves to. And like if they get there and they realize it was just too much, like they say, I can't be here, would we consider that a terrible thing?
No.
Right.
No, absolutely not.
So we want to give them an opportunity.
Yeah.
Or if they say, I want to hold my own private ceremony in the backyard, like what do we think of those kinds of impulses?
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And creating those opportunities for kids to do their own memorials is wonderful. There's all kinds of beautiful things that you can do with kids to help them to memorialize the person. It doesn't have to be a public service. You can help them to make a memory book or a memory box.
Yeah.
You can help them to, create a way. Maybe it's a time when you sit down and you have a conversation about the person. But yeah, so there's lots of sort of private, more personal ways that you can help them to remember also.
And as a final question, can I show kids how I'm feeling about the loss?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
It is okay for your children to know that that you're sad about it too.
Yeah. Even when they're not sad. Can I tell them when, I have a 9-year-old and 6-year-old, like if I'm sad and they don't appear to be sad, is it bad to show them that I'm feeling that way?
No, I think it's really okay for kids to experience our emotions. I think it's an opportunity to communicate that, we all experience a wide range of emotions, that emotions are okay. If we're really having a hard time and we're really, really, feeling like we're falling apart, we may want to rely on, we do want to rely on the other adults in our lives to provide the comfort and the support that we need. That may not be the time to initiate a conversation with your child when you're having that really overwhelming emotional response. But in general, it's okay for kids to see us experience our emotions. It's okay to acknowledge our emotions to children.
Yeah.
And we can show them, we can kind of model how the ebb and flow of emotions.
I like to think of it that, if we look at where kids get scared at like adult emotion or adult intensity, if we're continuing to signal to kids they are still safe and they are still loved, but that we are experiencing emotions within that kind of like space, we're not making any sort of threat to their existence.
Right.
We're saying like those two things you can still be very sure of. I'm still keeping you safe. I'm still absolutely love you, but also I am not in the best place that I could be. And I don't know if we have to put a value judgment on it. I'm second guessing that. I am not in the place where I'm most able to give my attention to you or something like that. But we know that it might be a temporary state, or we're kind of, sharing that with them.
And it's also, it really, I think, brings up the importance of community as well, right?
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
having family and community support. So letting your child know you have me and I love you, and you also have other people in your life who are there to support you.
And it's okay, there are people to rely on. Like it might not be that you're functioning at your most efficient during that time and while you're kind of in this grieving process. Well, Katie, look, thank you for this incredibly informative kind of run through of so many different topics in death and grief. For those of you listening, in the show notes, we will have articles on childmind.org, links to our Positive Parenting Thriving Kids series. We have curated resources as well as other videos on this particular topic. And stay tuned for future podcast episodes exploring other facets of the grieving process, the way that kids process traumatic events or difficult events in their lives, and all kinds of other things we'll discuss with Katie and other Child Mind Institute clinicians. Thanks again to Katie Peinovich for joining us today and sharing such compassionate, practical guidance on supporting kids through grief. Before we wrap up, I want to shift gears for just a moment. September is National Self-Care Month, and it's a good reminder that looking after yourself matters too.
Parenting, especially when your child is going through something difficult, can take a real emotional and physical toll. Too often, we put our own needs last, but the truth is that self-care isn't selfish, as we'll reference in an upcoming podcast episode with Dr. Joanna Kim from Arizona State University. It's what helps you stay steady, keep perspective, and be the parent your child needs. We've put together resources with evidence-based ideas for staying grounded, managing stress, and preventing burnout. You'll find strategies like mindfulness techniques, ways to build in moments of rest, and support options if you're feeling stretched thin. You can explore all of these at childmind.org/selfcare. That's all for this week's episode of the Thriving Kids podcast. I'm Dr. Dave Anderson. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.